After my family went bankrupt, my unreliable parents abandoned me to avoid debt. Until I met. I was once the son of a billionaire with wealth and glory at my fingertips. However, an unexpected phone call and the announcement of family bankruptcy instantly made me fall from heaven to hell. My parents donated the money and ran away, abandoning me. Their assets were frozen, and I was left with only $8 in my pocket. With my mentality broken, I thought my world was destroyed, but fate gave me an unexpected opportunity. Richard, my mortal enemy whom I once hated so much, appeared in front of me. Join forces with my former enemy? Or let him play me over? What secrets does this man, who has brought me so much humiliation since childhood, hide? Hi everyone, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and if you like this story, please let me know in the comment section. I will update the next part. My name is Benjamin. I never thought that I would go from being a rich young man to a poor man overnight. Benjamin, a name that has been accustomed to luxury since childhood, finally experienced what it means to fall from the altar today. From crossing my legs on the comfortable sofa in the Armani store to the frozen bank card, everything I had was gone in an instant. I was enjoying the privileges brought by money, and the world seemed to be tailor-made for me. The respectful attitude of the shop assistants and the dazzling array of luxury goods could not make me realize the challenges I was about to face in life. At that moment, the man standing aside and watching coldly, Richard, suddenly made me feel an unprecedented sense of oppression. He was my mortal enemy. When I was in high school, he used his power as class monitor to oppress me. It was like an invisible whip, constantly whipping my dignity. In every confrontation, I felt his silent contempt, and his undisguised confidence almost took my breath away. But today, in this luxurious store, I have to admit that the gap between him and me is not just in terms of grades and family background. Facing the frozen card, I felt a sense of tension I had never felt before. I always thought that wealth and status could make everything go smoothly, and even make him, the person who once made me suffer so much, bow his head. However, fate gave me a huge reversal, which made me begin to understand that all the pride I once had was really just a bubble. Richard was still the calm and composed man. His eyes did not have any extra expression, but I could read a deep sense of pleasure in them. Just when I couldn't find a solution for myself, my father's phone call broke my fantasy. Benjamin, Dad's company has problems. My home and my father, the pillars behind me that once made me fearless, suddenly collapsed. Your mother and I are going to be away for a while. You have to take care of yourself. You believe in yourself, and Dad believes in you. My father's words hit me like a heavy hammer. I knew that the turning point of my life was at this moment, and I could never go back to the world where everything was going well. The sense of superiority I once had was now nothing but a joke. Richard always seemed to see my most vulnerable side at the most critical moment. I couldn't help but ask myself, what should I do in the future? I really don't know how I walked out of that luxury store. My heart was filled with mixed emotions, and my mind was in a mess. Although my pockets were empty, I was unwilling to see myself in such a mess. When I walked to the car, I saw him, the man who had been giving me a headache since high school, Richard. He stood there, staring at me, as if everything in his eyes became insignificant. Damn it, why did it have to be him? I cursed in my heart, and my mind became even more confused. I stepped into the Bugatti Veyron with full confidence and started the car, but when I stepped on the accelerator, the car body crashed into the Maybach next to it. In an instant, all my self-esteem and pride were shattered, and my mood suddenly fell to the bottom. I hurriedly got off the car, knowing that I could not escape responsibility. Although this was a small punishment for me, I had to face it. Just as I was about to leave, Richard walked out of the store. He was neatly dressed, tall, and had a cold look in his eyes. I gritted my teeth. Why did I have to meet him at this time? It's over, it's over. I was panicking. I was going through the lowest point in my life, but he saw it clearly. It is unbelievable to me that the man who once made me bow my head in everything is now driving a Maybach. I know that Richard, his family, was not well off when he was in high school, and even had a tight budget for living, but now he drives a luxury car. Is there some kind of backstage connection? I couldn't help but speculate, feeling jealous and unwilling. Instinctively, I didn't want to admit my jealousy. Maybe he really achieved what he did because of his own efforts, but that wasn't fair to me. Facing this high-handed Richard, I felt an unprecedented sense of oppression. I didn't even dare to look at him straight in the eye, for fear that I would see more resentment and jealousy. And just as I was about to leave, bad luck struck again. Bang! I accidentally hit the Maybach again, and I wanted to find a crack in the ground to crawl into. Richard got out of the car. He was dressed in black, and his cold eyes made it almost impossible for me to breathe. I didn't dare to avoid him and could only stand there awkwardly. It's over, it's over. I repeated this sentence over and over in my mind. The squad leader who once made me feel that I had no chance was now standing in front of me, looking down on me. I was afraid that he would laugh at me or even take the opportunity to take revenge on me for what I had done in the past. Are you here to cause trouble for me? I was nervous, even though I forced myself to stay calm. Captain, are you here to shop as well? I tried to act relaxed and pretend that I had a good relationship with him. However, Richard had no expression on his face and seemed to have no interest in me. I greeted him warmly, but he looked indifferent and even pretended not to know me, which made me so angry that I complained a lot in my heart. After a lot of effort, he finally remembered who I was. I pretended to please him and exchanged pleasantries, hoping to get a ride with him. As a result, he asked all kinds of questions, including my name, contact information, and took photos. I thought it was a group photo, but it turned out to be a photo of the car I had used. He was so petty that I wanted to block him right away. When I got home, I found out that something worse was to come. My family's big estate was going to be closed down. Although I have an apartment and a luxury car in my name, so I'm not in poverty, but my parents abandoned me and ran away. It feels so bad that I even doubt whether I am their biological child. In the next few days, I had nothing to do in my apartment. It was summer vacation, and I used to have no worries about food and clothing, but now I have to search for food on QQ even when ordering takeout. I was feeling depressed when my friend called and said it was Jacob's birthday and everyone was waiting for me. Should I go or not? I was torn. If I went, I would be asked about my family affairs, which would be annoying. If I didn't go, I would be laughed at. After a struggle, I decided to go and experience the complicated social etiquette. I went out today to celebrate Jacob's birthday, so I was in a good mood. When I drove out of the apartment gate, I saw some people squatting against the wall with ugly faces, but I didn't pay any attention to them. When I arrived at Windsor, I threw the car keys to the waiter and went in. Unexpectedly, Richard also came and entered the adjacent box just before me. When I walked into Jacob's birthday box, the ghostly singing almost drove me away. I greeted him and threw the gift to Jacob. I thought we could have a good reunion, but I ran into Robert, this idiot. As soon as he opened his mouth, he asked me about my family's bankruptcy in a sarcastic way and pretended to be willing to help. I didn't tolerate him, so I directly confronted him and asked him to lend me several million yuan and even brought up the embarrassing incident of his car being stolen and sprayed. This really pissed him off, and he started to curse and even insulted my mother. I couldn't stand it anymore, so I picked up the bottle and threw it at him. For a moment, the box was in chaos, with people fighting and those trying to stop the fight. When I was dragged out, I saw Richard. Why is this unlucky guy here? I was so angry that I thought he was here to sell himself as a male escort. At this time, Robert was still yelling, saying that I was a waste, saying that I was nothing now, and even threatened to send me to jail. I got so angry when I heard that. I broke free from the people holding me and rushed towards him. He was so scared that he ran away, but was tripped by Richard's legs. I took the opportunity to grab him. I was about to beat him up, and a group of people came to stop the fight, and Jacob also came out to persuade me, but I just couldn't listen. At this time, the security guard and the manager came. The manager was afraid that the matter would get out of hand, so he sent Robert to the hospital first. Then he stopped me. I was unhappy and wanted to go home, so he let me go. After leaving Windsor, I thought it was the security guard following me, but when I turned around, it was Richard. I was already annoyed, so I asked him to stay away from me. He didn't say anything, which made me even angrier. I told him that since I met him, I've been extremely unlucky. My father went bankrupt, and I was in jail for fighting with someone. When I mentioned Robert, I got angry again and said I hated him and Richard the most. Richard laughed, walked up to me, and asked me who he was. Of course, I knew he was Richard. He also asked me if I was afraid of going to police station and took out his cell phone to record me while drunk. When Richard asked me if there was any way to avoid going to police, I responded angrily. Do you want me to apologize to that bastard? No way. He described to me the terrible life after being in the police station, especially when I heard that I had to recite the prison rules and regulations. My scalp tingled, and I hurriedly asked him if he had any solution. He also deliberately kept me in suspense. I was so anxious that I subconsciously wanted to pay for it, but when I touched my pocket, I remembered that I had no money. I had no choice but to ask him to lend me money and pour out my sorrows to him, telling him how miserable my life was because my parents had abandoned me. He remained silent, and I jumped out of the car in a hurry, spraining my ankle and falling to my knees. I reached out to grab him to stand up and almost pulled his pants off. He asked me to pull him, but I refused. A couple passed by and thought I was asking for forgiveness. It was a misunderstanding. Finally, Richard agreed to lend me the money, but he had to use something as collateral. Last night was a mess and absurdity. Robert and I had a big fight in Windsor, and it was a mess. I twisted my ankle, and it was swollen and painful. I couldn't walk. Just when I was at a loss, Richard said he was willing to lend me money to settle the matter. I was so excited at that time and talked a lot. I even complained to him about how stubborn and annoying he was in school. As a result, when he let go of my hand, I almost fell on him. I even bumped into a car when I was walking, and in the end, I had to ask him to hold me. I woke up near noon today, and my ankle still hurts. I remembered Richard borrowed $200,000 from me last night, but when I searched my wallet, the card was missing. I called him, and he hung up on me. Just when I was full of doubt, he called back and said that I gave him the money back and asked him to solve Robert's problem, but I have no recollection of this. I had originally planned to spend the money on Robert and spend the rest on myself, but now it was all gone, and I felt terrible. But then I thought about the luxury goods I bought before and could exchange them for money, so I felt better and prepared to go to the supermarket to buy some things. When I arrived at the garage, I found that the Cullinan that I drove out last night was not there. I wanted to drive the Ferrari, but the Ferrari was missing and the G-Class was nowhere to be seen either. In a panic, I asked the property management to check the surveillance and saw that it was Richard who drove away my car and stole the spare key. This really pissed me off, so I called him right away to question him. Mr. Shao, you stole my car. I was wondering why you were so kind of lending me money, but it turns out you were thinking of stealing my car keys. Are you stupid? You didn't even wear stockings when you stole a car. The surveillance camera captured it, and the neighborhood has called the police. Just wait to be taken to the police station. I was so angry with Richard that I called him and yelled at him, but he asked me to look at the note under my pillow. I ran to take a look and saw that it said that my 3 cars were temporarily stored by him for loan and compensation and would not be returned until the loan was paid back, and there were also our signatures and fingerprints. I was completely dumbfounded, and then I realized that I was tricked by him. Not only did I get the 200,000 yuan, but I also lost the luxury car. I was so angry and anxious that I called him repeatedly, but he hung up every time I opened my mouth to curse. I really wanted to cry, but I couldn't even cry. How could he bully me like this? My family is bankrupt. No, I must go to him to argue, and I also want to call the police to arrest him and even report him for being a male PR. I limped out of the apartment door and was waiting for a bus when suddenly more than a dozen people surrounded me, saying that my father owed them wages and asked me to pay them back. I tried to pretend that I didn't know him, but they compared the photo with the clothes and watch I was wearing and determined that I was the only son of the Luo family. They snatched my cell phone and tried to force me to tell them my father's new phone number. They also took off my clothes and my watch. I really had no choice but to pretend to have a heart attack. They ran away because they were afraid of being held responsible. The security guard found me and helped me into the security room. My ankle was even more swollen. At this time, I was hungry and angry, so I picked up my phone and called Richard, asking him to come to my house quickly and bring me the salmon sashimi from the shop on Fuyuan Street. Humph, if he doesn't come, I will crawl over to settle the score with him, even if I have to. Richard's words were like a bucket of cold water, directly extinguishing my expectation that he would come. I sat in the security room, staring at my swollen ankle. Every time I looked at it, I felt more angry and helpless. Richard to argue with him in my current state, I might be easily knocked down by him before I even start. It is really not a wise move. Okay, a gentleman's revenge is never too late, so I will let him have a few more days of freedom. Fortunately, the service in the community is considerate and thoughtful. Various nursing supplies, doctor's examinations, and snacks are arranged one after another. I ate my favorite cat ears, turned on the air conditioner, played with my phone, and spent the afternoon leisurely. At mealtime, the young and shy security guard brought me a bowl of egg soup, egg fried rice, and flour rolls. I teased him a few times, and his ears turned red, which made me feel better temporarily. But at this moment, I turned around and saw Richard standing at the door wearing a gray polo shirt. Instantly, anger surged up in my heart again. Like an angry lion, I rushed over, grabbed his collar, and shouted, "Xiao, how dare you show up?" Return my car to me. He just looked at me indifferently and even said that he bought the salmon I wanted, trying to coax me back. I would not be fooled and continued to scold him as a liar. He was probably feeling embarrassed and didn't want to be watched, so he grabbed me, forced me into the car, and drove away from the apartment. Along the way, I cursed until my mouth was dry, but he remained silent. As the scenery outside the window changed, the flat road turned into a rugged mountain road. The surroundings became increasingly dark and silent, and fear began to spread in my heart. I couldn't help but ask, "Richard, where are you taking me?" He coldly spat out 2 words, "The cemetery." My heart suddenly tightened and my voice trembled. "What are you doing in the cemetery so late at night?" You want to burn paper?" In fact, I was so scared that I didn't dare to think in a more terrifying direction. I pretended to be calm and said, "Why don't you go and do your work? Just put me down. I have things to do." Richard saw my panic in the rearview mirror and teased me deliberately, saying that there were many mosquitoes in the wild mountains and wilderness, and that there were wolves in the mountains and people had died, and there were crying sounds at night. I didn't dare to say anything, and quickly said I would not get off the car. I was scolding him fiercely before, but now I was scared because it was too scary in the wilderness at night. Then, he said that I was the one who wanted to mortgage the car to him. I cursed him for his lies, but I didn't dare to refute him, so I could only pretend to believe him. He also kept teasing me, and I couldn't stand it anymore, so I just pretended to sleep and escaped. I don't know how long it was before he woke me up and said he had arrived at his grandmother's house. It was an unfamiliar courtyard, like an old country house from the last century. I followed him into the house, curious about why he came here, but he told me to go back to the house and sit down. I was fiddling with my swollen ankle out of boredom when he suddenly threw me a black box. When I opened it, I found the salmon I'd been dreaming about. This was totally unexpected. I thought he wouldn't buy it, but he actually brought it. I ate the salmon with relish. The salmon tasted fresh and smooth. As I ate, I thought I should leave a few pieces for Richard. After all, I was still counting on him to return my car to me, so I had to please him. But when I realized what was happening, I hadn't seen him for a long time. My heart skipped a beat. Could it be that he used the salmon to distract me and then ran away secretly? He left me alone in this unfamiliar place. How could I get back? The more I thought about it, the more I felt that Richard might just abandon me here and run away. I was so anxious that I didn't care about my swollen ankle and limped out, shouting, "Richard! Richard!" His somewhat impatient voice came from the side, asking me to keep my voice down. I followed the sound and found a makeshift bathroom. Just as I walked to the door, it opened and Richard came out with a towel around his neck, shirtless and wearing only a pair of shorts. His hair was still wet, his shoulders were broad, and his chest and abdominal muscles were clearly defined. I couldn't help but sigh in my heart that he really had a good body. He saw me staring at his abdominal muscles and teased me if I was jealous. I refused to accept it and immediately lifted up my clothes and put them down quickly, insisting that I also had 8 abdominal muscles, although not as obvious as his. He smiled, said nothing more, turned and left. I muttered to myself that he was so annoying. When it was time to take a shower, he gave me all the old clothes he had put there before, even some used underwear. I really couldn't accept wearing other people's underwear, but he said that if I didn't wear it, I wouldn't wash it, so I had no choice but to compromise. When I walked into the bathroom, I thought there would be a bathtub, but there was only a shower head. I didn't even know how to use it, so I had to call him in to help. He came in and taught me how to turn it on, and the water would come out, and he said there was no way to adjust the water temperature. I just squatted down to get the shower gel when I suddenly saw some bugs crawling out of the sewer. I was so scared that I quickly called Richard. I shouted while picking up my slippers to swat the bug to death. When he came in and asked me why I called him, I realized that I just called him out. After taking a shower, I didn't wear his underwear, which was really uncomfortable. I carried the dirty clothes and asked him where the washing machine was. He said it was in Grandma's room. I was confused and couldn't understand why the washing machine was in the bedroom. I asked where the laundry detergent was, and he said it was on the windowsill. In the end, there was only laundry powder, so I made do with it. I filled a basin with water, poured in a lot of detergent, and started washing clothes. I learned this skill from helping my mother with housework in kindergarten. At that time, my hands were small, and my mother asked me to wash some small items, such as scarves and handkerchiefs, and she kept praising me for doing a good job. After being encouraged, I worked very hard. After washing the handkerchiefs and silk scarves, I went to the closet to find a lot of small clothes and threw them all into the washing basin with great effort. My mother just went to answer a phone call, and when she came back, she saw a lot of her underwear soaking in the basin, and I washed them very seriously at that time. Benjamin, whose skill in washing clothes was never very good, just squeezed a few times and rinsed off the foam. He returned to the room, sat on the sofa, and rested, watching Richard sitting on the bedside processing documents. A few days ago, I couldn't imagine being in the same room with him peacefully, wearing his clothes. Things are unpredictable, and I have become so humble after bankruptcy. Suddenly, I found that there was only a 1.5-meter long broken wooden bed in the room. I asked Richard how I was going to sleep at night, and he asked me to sleep next to him. I was shocked. How could two grown men sleep together? But he said there was no other room, and he turned off the lights and went to sleep. I couldn't sleep on the sofa, so I went to bed in the dark to retaliate by slapping him, but he grabbed my wrist accurately. After a struggle, I could only sleep with my back to him in anger. I usually fall asleep as soon as I touch the pillow, and I slept until about 8 in the morning. When I woke up, I found that I was bitten by mosquitoes many times. White skin attracts mosquitoes. My ankles were so swollen that they were too small for my shoes. I walked out of the room and ran into Richard's grandmother. Grandma said Richard went to burn paper for his mother, and she went out early in the morning to buy safflower oil to treat my sprained foot. Grandma was very enthusiastic and wanted to help me apply safflower oil. I wanted to do it myself, but Grandma insisted. While applying the medicine, I curiously asked my grandmother when Richard passed away and took the opportunity to ask about his past 2 years. My grandmother said that Richard's mother died unexpectedly, and he took care of the funeral alone. She also comforted my sick grandmother and said that she would take good care of her in the future. Listening to what my grandmother said, I began to wonder, how could the swindler who stole my car be so gentle and considerate to his family? My grandmother also praised me for my good character and told me not to mind Richard's little flaws and to get along well with him. But can I really get along well with such a hypocritical person? I thought to myself, Richard is shy? I really didn't see that at all. But I nodded in agreement to my grandmother. When my grandmother served me rice, she wore disposable gloves, fearing that her hands would be stained with the smell of safflower oil. She also kindly took out a bottle of mosquito repellent, saying that I was pitiful for being bitten by mosquitoes. I thanked my grandmother and finished breakfast. Richard came back with muddy shoes and wet trouser legs. After he had finished cleaning up, he also sat under the locust tree with us. I stared at him, wanting to see if he had cried after burning paper for his mother. He seemed fine, and even teased me that the mosquito bites were like blood dripping to recognize relatives. I was so angry that I retorted to him that mosquitoes must be from the same family as him. Richard persuaded my grandmother to move to the city, but she was used to the countryside and refused to move. I was curious about Richard's temper and bullying my grandmother, and I kept staring at him. He asked me if I thought he was good-looking, and I quickly changed my words to praise him for being handsome. I deliberately called him by his nickname, and he was very unhappy. I also half-truthfully praised him for helping me with my homework and maintaining my car a few days ago in front of my grandmother, but in fact I was hinting that he cheated me of my car. He also followed my words and responded in a sarcastic tone, and I kept cursing him in my heart for being shameless. I realized I couldn't win the argument, so we left without eating lunch. Grandma kept watching us. In the car, my phone was out of battery and turned off, so I was bored and started talking to Richard. I called him Xiao-E, and he almost crashed the car and told me not to call him that. I retorted that his grandmother also called him that, and he stopped the car and wanted to force me to get out. I ignored him, but he actually came to pull me. I held the steering wheel tightly, thinking that the car keys had been pulled out by him, so I couldn't threaten him back, so I could only say that he had to take me back and would not get out of the car. I was so angry that I yelled and scolded Richard for bringing me here without asking me, and now abandoning me, saying that he was cruel and unmanly to beat around the bush. But he asked me to say something nice, and then he would take me back. Although I was reluctant, I still praised him, saying that he had good grades, was handsome, and had a good figure, and I praised him as the light that illuminated my life. Richard was stunned and probably suspected that I was schizophrenic. I thought he was impressed by his eloquence, and he didn't mention the incident of leaving me behind after he got in the car. As soon as I picked up the car, he looked at me coldly. I felt that this topic was inappropriate and I would talk about it another day. After we entered the city, he gave me a bottle of medicinal wine given by my grandmother, and I asked him to thank my grandmother for me. When we were almost at the apartment, there was a traffic jam, and he asked me to get out of the car with my swollen feet. I was so angry that I got out of the car and cursed that the words I had praised him before were all said against my conscience, and then slammed the car door. I was limping along, and Richard chased me. I thought he was looking for trouble, so I ran away in fear. But he said I left my phone in the car, and I took it. He even teased me for saying one thing and thinking another. I had just taken a few steps when I saw a dozen people in the corner shouting at me. The son must pay for the father's debt, asking me to pay back the money. I quickly turned to Richard for help. He turned back when he heard the voice, and I explained that these people were asking my father for money. As soon as I finished speaking, the group of people surrounded me and told me to call my dad out. They also said that I pretended to have a heart attack yesterday to deceive them, and it was useless to pretend today. They forced me to make the phone call. I was so pissed off. I thought I could fool them by pretending to have a heart attack yesterday. It would take them 2 days at most to come back, so I didn't rush to call the police when my watch was stolen. I still remembered the hippopotamus-like guy who stole my watch. I didn't expect him to come again today. When I saw him, I said I would call the police. I reached into Richard's pocket to get his cell phone, but he held my hand as I dialed the number. I was just wondering when I saw Richard with a cold face scolding the debt collectors, saying that they were breaking the law, intimidating, gathering a crowd to cause trouble, and instigating others to gather and threaten. He also pointed out that the person who stole the watch was guilty of robbery, and his accomplices could not escape. He also explained that it was illegal for a son to pay off his father's debt in my case. And finally, he sternly demanded that they get out of the way. I felt like Richard was a parent protecting his child, and those people got out of the way. I looked at him and thought it would be better for us to go back together. So I said directly, "Let's go. Let's go back," and took his arm. Although he frowned, I still took him into the apartment. As soon as I entered the apartment, I praised him for his brilliant speech and sincerely praised his clear analysis. I also asked him about his university major, and I was even more impressed when I learned that it was finance, but he knew so much about law. When we arrived at my door, I sincerely invited him to come in and sit down. There was only water in the house. As soon as I walked in, my high-tech gadget called him a car thief. I quickly turned it off and explained awkwardly that it had been broken for several days and I wanted to throw it away, but he wanted to pick it up and fix it. I complained in my heart that he was so shameless. I poured water for both of them, took some ankle medicine, first thanked him for his help, and praised him a lot before getting to the point. I begged him to return my bike to me, saying that the other 2 bikes were pressing on his, and it was really inconvenient for me. I also said that I was ignorant when I was in school and begged him not to mind. Seeing Richard refuse, I was so angry that I wanted to bite him. Those cars were originally mine. Maybe I was tricked by him into pawning them to him that night. But I quickly suppressed my anger and thought away. In the past few contacts, I found that he liked to hear nice words. "Class monitor, please have pity on me. I know you don't let me drive because you're afraid I'll sell the car at a low price. You take care of me when I'm in school, I understand. But it's really inconvenient for me without a car. How about I use something else as collateral?" I said as I moved closer to him, put my arm on his shoulder, and looked at him expectantly. He asked what I wanted to exchange for collateral. I quickly stood up and took out a bunch of luxury goods, telling him that they were all brand new. I also introduced the prices, saying that the sunglasses cost 20,000 yuan and the projector cost 40,000 yuan, but he felt that it was not cost-effective and refused. Seeing that he was about to leave, I quickly grabbed his clothes and pretended to be pitiful, saying that my family had gone bankrupt, my parents had run away, I was penniless, and I was going to sell things. I looked up at him eagerly, squeezing out tears as I spoke, trying to soften his heart. Seeing that he was unmoved, I used my ultimate move, hugged his waist, and started pretending to cry, saying that I was still a young master the day before yesterday, but now I want to commit suicide, and I said that I didn't jump because I didn't want to cause trouble to him. I was about to say that he stopped me from committing suicide, but he guessed it first. I quickly changed my words and said I was afraid no one would come to collect the body, and tried to please him, saying that I would go through fire and water for him if he had any problems in the future. From childhood to adulthood, I have never said so many flattering words to anyone, except for coaxing Wonkai when he was sick when I was 3 years old. At this time, Richard asked me when my parents would be back, and reminded me that I should consider my livelihood since I had no money and that the property fee was about to expire. He also recommended me to apply for an internship at a company, and said that if I was successful in the application, I would be given a car. My eyes lit up when I heard that. Richard said really, with certainty, and I immediately let go of him to get my phone. He quickly recommended the company to me. I carefully checked the company information and recruitment page and didn't even notice when he left. Over the next few days, I was busy preparing for the job application and repeatedly bothered Richard by sending him messages to ask questions. I was struggling over which position to apply for. I thought receptionist was a simple job, but he said the salary was low. In the end, he suggested that I choose assistant and told me that I should be confident. After the conversation, I threw my phone aside. It was only when I was taking a shower at night that he replied with the words, "Keep it up." It was really confusing. On the day of the interview, I pulled out my light gray casual suit, paired it with white sneakers, and combed my hair before going out. My ankle had almost healed after a few days of rest, but it was a little sore when I walked fast. After explaining my purpose at the company, I went up to the waiting area on the second floor and found that there were more than 20 people applying for the job. I listened to Richard's application for an assistant, asked him for his opinion on my resume, and then asked my dad's former special assistant to revise it, making it have almost nothing to do with me. Richard read it and thought it was okay. I could have applied for a waiter position in a store, but I was used to being a waiter and couldn't accept serving others. Also, since I was working in a company, I had to say it nicely and didn't want to be laughed at by my friends. I also asked Richard what his relationship with the company was and whether he could help me. He didn't give me a direct answer, but I thought it might be possible. I felt that I had become closer to him in the past few days. Perhaps we had built a bridge between friends and enemies, just like establishing diplomatic relations. I felt that he would help me with the job application. Sitting in the waiting area, I was extremely nervous because this was related to the return of the luxury car and my future income. I was already a sophomore, and I hadn't attended classes before, so I couldn't understand anything when I went back to school. I had no intention of going back to school. I took a picture of myself waiting with my phone and was about to send it to Richard to ask him to wish me a successful job, when suddenly, with a bang, a phone hit me on the head. I looked up and saw a bearded man going crazy, cursing at the woman next to him. He was going to throw his phone at her, but it hit me instead. The man and the woman had just divorced, but he was pestering her and using threats and violence to get her to remarry. The woman's previous job was ruined by him, but she was found again when she came to apply for a job this time. The man dragged the woman and asked her to go back. The woman was so scared that she burst into tears and refused, and even stepped on my foot. At first, I thought the interview was more important and didn't want to make a fuss about it. I even wanted to quietly take away the phone that was thrown at me. But he came to hurt me again and bullied a woman. I really couldn't stand it anymore. So I shouted for the security guard, but the man scolded me for shouting nonsense. When his fist almost hit me, I was completely furious. The man was 178 centimeters tall, and I was 184 centimeters tall. He was already shaking his fist at me, so I couldn't be polite. I stood up and fought him. In an instant, a big fight was about to break out. The man rushed over to me, and I grabbed his arm with the help of the taekwondo I learned when I was a child and threw him down with a domineering shoulder throw. Then I twisted his arm, half knelt on the ground, pressed one leg on his back, and held him down tightly and shouted coldly, "Apologize." I seldom used this move in fights before. Firstly, I had almost forgotten it, and secondly, when I had a conflict with Richard in my freshman year of high school, I used this move, but he easily pinned me to the ground. It was so embarrassing. But this time, I succeeded in throwing the man to the ground. He struggled like a wild boar, and I used all my strength to prevent him from breaking free. I forced him to apologize again, and he howled in pain, sweat on his head, and finally begged for mercy. I looked up and signaled the terrified woman to run away, and then the security guards came. Many people helped to testify that the man suddenly hit someone and might have violent tendencies, so the security guards took the man away. Everyone praised me, and I felt very happy, thinking that it wasn't a fight for no reason and might even get extra point for the interview. But time passed slowly, and the interviewees went in one by one, but I was never called. When there were only 2 or 3 people left, I panicked and quickly sent a message to Richard. I explained the reason for the fight, and he said that the interviewer might know that I was brave and asked if he could help me ask about the situation, so I quickly asked him to ask. Finally, Richard replied that I was the last one to be interviewed. At this moment, my name was called. I walked into the office, handed in my resume, and then answered the interviewer's questions. I had already predicted these questions with Richard and my father's special assistant, and I memorized the answers for the sake of the luxury car. After the interviewer asked me to go to the lobby on the first floor and wait for notification in 2 hours. One of the interviewers even recognized me as the boy who was in uniform and praised me for being brave. 2 hours later, the result came out and I was hired. I excitedly sent a message to Richard, and he replied, "Congratulations." I reminded him that he promised to give me the car, and he agreed and asked me to treat him to a meal to celebrate. I agreed without hesitation, and even wanted to go to him immediately to get the Bugatti Veyron back. He teased me again if I couldn't wait to see him, and I excitedly replied that I really wanted to see him and wanted to fly to him right away and get the car back. Richard sent me his location, and I immediately took a taxi to the place. When I got there, I found that it was a villa area. I asked him which building he was in, and then I hurried over. When I got to the villa, I rang the doorbell. Soon the door opened, and Richard stood in the door, wiping his wet hair. He was shirtless and wearing gray home pants with a waist so low that his mermaid line was exposed. I was in a good mood, so I greeted him with a smile, complimented his figure, touched him, and squeezed into the house. As soon as I entered the house, I was attracted by the villa. The exterior was an aristocratic European style, while the interior was in modern black and white, simple and elegant. I asked if I could go upstairs to take a look. When I learned that he lived alone, I started to walk around the house and even went upstairs. This villa has 2.5 floors, and the half-floor terrace has a parasol and a swimming pool. I love it so much that I'm thinking of buying one here when I have money. After the tour, I sat down, crossed my legs, and praised his house. Seeing that he hadn't put on his clothes yet, I reminded him that he was going to eat. He went upstairs to change into trousers and shirts, and I praised him again, hoping to make him happy and return my car. We talked about the topic of marriage. I praised him in various exaggerated ways, saying that anyone who didn't like him was an idiot. He actually agreed with me. How narcissistic. As we were talking, it suddenly started to rain. We waited for more than an hour, and it was almost noon, so I suggested ordering takeout. I took out my phone and asked him to order, but he asked me to do it himself because he was afraid it would exceed my budget. When I started to order, he stood up and came back to give me the key to the Mercedes-Benz G-Class. I wanted a Bugatti, but he said it would be too conspicuous to drive to work, so I had to give in and asked if I could trade the G-Class for the Bugatti, and he agreed. Richard was particularly good at talking today. He listened quietly when I talked about the interview during dinner. The takeaway arrived, and we ate and talked while watching the rain outside the window. After eating, I didn't want to move, so Richard went to clean up and turn on the air purifier. I sat on the sofa, watching him busy, teasing him that he was a good man, imitating girls acting coquettishly to him, imagining his married life, and couldn't help laughing. When he heard this, his eyes darkened and he walked towards me. Richard actually said that I had imagined marrying him before, and even joked whether I felt like I was marrying him. I was confused, and he asked me to help him because it was lying down and not working. I didn't want to move and made excuses to shirk, but he actually asked me to call him husband, and in order to avoid working, I had to do it. After hearing this, he pressed his tongue against his cheek and inexplicably had a bit of evil and turned back to the kitchen. I stayed at Richard's place until the rain stopped, then left in my fully fueled G-Class. The next day at work, I first met the HR manager, got my work badge, learned about the daily work, and then followed him to meet my boss. When I entered the office and saw the person behind the desk, I was stunned. It was Richard. After the manager introduced me, I called out his name. The manager was startled and hurried to explain to Richard. Richard asked the manager to leave, and we were the only ones left in the office. I questioned him and found out that this was one of his subsidiaries. I was confused. After 2 years of not seeing each other, how could he become a rich young man while I became poor? He refused to answer because he was working, so I said I would ask him to explain after I get off work. After that, I went to work. Richard had 3 assistants, and I was the total of 4. There was a capable boss who worked independently, and the other 3 worked together. Our main job was to run errands to various departments, print documents, etc. I wanted to work hard and was looking through the documents at first, but I couldn't sit still after an hour. I felt the chair was uncomfortable, so I thought about buying a potted plant and started chatting with the female assistant. The female assistant, 21 years old, just graduated from college. She is very pretty and speaks softly. At first glance, she looks like the well-behaved type. I just came to the company today and met a girl named Jessica. After work, she asked me why I didn't go out for dinner and was worried that I couldn't find a restaurant. She had been looking for a restaurant for a long time. I told her I had an appointment and asked her to take me to buy a small potted plant after the appointment. After all, we exchanged contact information which could be used at work. At this time, Richard came out of the office and saw me saying goodbye to Jessica and staring at her. He coughed and left. I hurriedly caught up with him and asked him to treat me to a meal. I said that he was in a high position and it was natural for him to treat me. And I said that I would just have a bowl of noodles with gravy, and then I used his background as an excuse and begged him in a coquettish and whining manner. Richard was amused by me and agreed to go out for dinner. When we got to the private room, I was expecting him to talk about his experiences in the past 2 years, but he didn't say anything for a long time. I used the skills I learned from watching short videos and said that I was not too curious about his life experience, and if he wanted to talk, he could talk, and if he didn't want to talk, I wouldn't force him, thinking that he would definitely talk. As a result, he directly said, "Then I won't say anything." I was instantly confused. What kind of crappy skills did this short video teach? I couldn't ask any more questions. I couldn't even enjoy my meal. Just when I was feeling depressed, Jessica called and said she was going to buy flowers. I hurriedly finished my meal, told Richard that I would leave if I had something to do, and met Jessica downstairs and went to the flower shop. I wanted to buy 2 pots of Chinese evergreen, one for Richard, but I was afraid Jessica would ask about it, so I only bought one. Jessica bought a pot of pink daisies. We were chatting on the way back, and when we arrived at the company gate, Jessica saw Richard first and called out, "Mr. Xiao," and then I noticed him. Richard said the flowers were nice. I thought he was talking about daisies, but he meant the Chinese evergreens and took mine away and asked if I bought the daisies. When I learned that I did, he said the company wanted to change the green plants and asked me to go and buy them. This reversal really caught me off guard. On my first day at work, Richard assigned me the task of purchasing green plants. I was full of enthusiasm and took out a pen and paper to ask carefully about the details, thinking about doing a good job. But he suddenly frowned and said that I had to ask him such a small matter and asked me to go to his office. I was stunned at the time. Why did my positive attitude make him angry? Jessica looked worried, probably thinking that I, a rookie in the workplace, was going to be kicked out by my boss. I was also wondering, we were having dinner and chatting happily half an hour ago. Why did he suddenly change his attitude? He couldn't just talk things over nicely, but had to act like a boss, which was really annoying. When we got to the office, I asked him why he yelled in front of Jessica. He asked me if Jessica was an outsider. So what was he? I didn't want to argue with him and continue to complain that leaders love to scold people. If I were a leader in the future, I would definitely not do this. He didn't refute me, but just stared at me. I didn't know what he was thinking. Seeing that he didn't say anything, I planned to go buy some green plants first. He suddenly said that he would never criticize me in front of outsiders. When I heard that, I took away the Chinese evergreen that I had carefully selected on the table. I couldn't let him get it for free. In the afternoon, I went to purchase green plants. After consulting the owner of the flower shop, I picked out the ones that were suitable for display in the company. I was so busy placing them and watering them that I was dizzy. I also spilled a lot of water. I mopped the floor for a long time. It was 8:30 in the evening when I finished. My stomach was growling with hunger. When I returned to my workstation, I found that the light in Richard's office was still on. What a hardworking guy. I couldn't care less about that. I remembered that the barbecue coupon I had grabbed before expired today. I had to hurry, otherwise there would be no seats left. So I packed up my things quickly and ran towards the barbecue restaurant. Thinking that I would be able to eat barbecue soon, my mood instantly became better. At the end of the first day of work, I Benjamin summed it up and felt that it was okay, not bad, and acceptable. After eating barbecue and going home, I washed up early, put on a bare ear eye mask, and prepared to have a good sleep, determined to change the bad habit of staying up late and become an ambitious young man. But I was so excited that I couldn't sleep at all. I felt the air conditioner was too cold, the quilt was too hot, I was thirsty, and I wanted to go to the bathroom. I felt that I had too much to do. I had no choice but to get up and do physics questions when it was almost dawn. But I was so sleepy in less than 5 minutes that I fell asleep in seconds without even turning off the lights. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the alarm clock rang. Get up and make money. That bastard Richard is your boss. I reached out to turn it off in a daze, struggled to sit up. My eyes were too sleepy to open. There were red marks on my face. The collar of my pajamas was crooked, and a lot of silly hair stood up. Another alarm clock rang. Are you still not getting up? Want to get scolded by Richard for being late? As long as you get up, you are Richard's father. I was annoyed by the noise and didn't want to get up, but when I heard the alarm clock ringing, Richard is crying and calling you dad downstairs. I couldn't help laughing and felt a little more energetic. I looked at my phone, but there was no call from my parents. I felt a little sad, but I had to get on with my life. There was a bit of traffic during the morning rush hour, and it was almost 8 o'clock when I arrived at the company. Most of my colleagues had arrived, and I sat down and stared at the potted plants, poking at the leaves. At this time, Richard came, and I lazily called Mr. Xiao. The morning went smoothly. It wasn't hard to go to work. I just had to type documents, copy plans, and run errands. At noon, Jessica and I went to the cafeteria. The food was good. I had 2 big bowls of rice. I felt sleepy after dinner, and it was uncomfortable to lie down at my workstation. I slept so well lying down when I was in high school, but now my arms get numb after a while. I didn't want to sleep anymore, so I checked my phone. I saw Richard walking by, so I called him, but he gave me a cold look and went into the office. I knew that I had to call Mr. Shao in the company, so I stood up and knocked on the door and went in. Mr. Shao, it's time to get off work now. Can I discuss something with you? I went in and asked, looking around. Don't you have a secret door? Do you have a lounge? I didn't go to bed until almost dawn and woke up at 6 o'clock. Can I sleep here for a while? After all, we are old classmates after get off work, so this request is not too much. There's no lounge. Richard unbuttoned his shirt and looked at me, his eyes like a beast staring at its prey. I complained that he should get a lounge so that it would be convenient for him to have a girlfriend in the future. As I said this, I retreated to the sofa and lay down. Although the posture was uncomfortable, it was better than lying prone. I asked him if it was convenient for me to sleep here, but he teased me that I built the lounge for myself. I quickly explained that it was for him and his girlfriend to have sex, and I was curious whether he had a girlfriend. He said no, and I didn't believe him. He actually admitted that he was lying. I felt like I was being scolded. He asked me if I had a girlfriend, and I said I was annoyed by seeing other people quarreling in love, so I didn't want to date. He also asked if I had ever held hands with a girl or kissed a girl, and if I was a virgin, which made me blush. Don't bother with me anymore. Go to sleep. I was originally drooping my legs, and after falling asleep, I felt uncomfortable, so I leaned on the sofa. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up, I was covered with a piece of clothing, and the alarm on my cell phone suddenly rang. Richard is crying and calling your dad downstairs. Get up and go see him. I turned my head and saw Richard processing documents at his desk. I was instantly embarrassed, so I quickly turned off the alarm and left the office in a hurry. The alarm was clearly not set for this. This was over. Richard would definitely hold a grudge. I was worried all afternoon. I finally got to the end of the workday and was packing up to go home when I heard, Benjamin, Mr. Shao wants to see you. Alas, what was supposed to come finally came. I deliberately took my time packing my things and go to meet him with my school bag on my back. Wanted to let him know that I was off work and not to delay him too long. I knocked on the door and went in. Richard said that his car was being serviced and asked me to take him back. I was unwilling to do so and made an excuse that I had to go to the mall to buy something first, but he interrupted me and asked what happened to the alarm clock at noon. I quickly slipped away and said I would wait for him outside. When we drove to the mall parking lot, I asked Richard to buy it himself, but he asked me to go and said I didn't have to pay him back. When we entered the supermarket, he only gave me a small row of AD calcium milk. I was furious, and he even said I was narrow-minded. I asked him sarcastically if I could buy whatever I wanted, and he agreed. I was not afraid and started a shopping spree, and soon the shopping cart was full. Richard looked at me until I took a bottle of mouthwash, and he actually asked how to use it. I complained that he was surprised. After the shopping, more than 10 shopping carts full of things were pushed to the checkout counter, and Richard actually paid the bill. But when I was moving the things, he stood there and didn't help, and even said that I looked like a loader. I was afraid that he would regret it. So I decided to carry the things back to my house first. When I got downstairs to my building, I found a lot of people gathered in the corridor. One of the owners told me that many residents in the building had been robbed, and asked me to check if anything was missing from my house. When I heard that, I felt nervous, worried that those luxury items were gone. I was so unlucky today. After finishing work, I strode home, unlocked the door with my fingerprint, and thought that I could exchange those luxury goods for money in an emergency. But when I looked at the place where I put the things, I was completely stunned. The floor was in a mess. The boxes of luxury goods were all opened, and the items inside were all gone. I searched desperately, but found nothing. The thief really didn't leave anything behind. I felt like the sky was falling, and I thought about exchanging money in a few days. Why couldn't he steal 2 days later? I slumped on the floor, leaving the door open. Richard followed me in and carried the things I bought at the supermarket into the house. An owner whose property had been robbed came in and asked me to register and count what was missing. I didn't respond, so Richard did it for me. Richard comforted me that he could catch the thief, but I felt that he and I were not compatible and that all the bad things happened because of him. My family went bankrupt. I had to pay compensation for fighting, creditors came to my house, and now my things were stolen 2 days after I started working. I said I wanted to resign and complained that he was unlucky for me. Richard said that if I changed my mindset, he could help me solve the problem. I didn't believe him, so I asked him to lend me 3 million yuan to try. He actually asked for my car number. I suspected that he was trying to cheat me again. After all, he mortgaged 3 of my cars when he borrowed 200,000 yuan last time. He said he liked my house. I was furious and told him to get out. Then he said I had stolen his car and demanded 2.6 million yuan in compensation, and even produced evidence. I was furious. This was just taking advantage of someone's misfortune. I stood up to leave, but he was still thinking about my house. I rushed over to him, pinned him down, and scolded him, saying that he had bullied me since high school, and he still wouldn't let me go. But I didn't dare to hit him, and he didn't struggle. Finally, he turned over and pressed me down, and the atmosphere was awkward. Later, I went into the bedroom, locked the door, opened some chips and Coke, and played DJ music loudly, just to piss him off to death. Fate was unfair, and I had to fight to the end. After I came out of the room to pee, I found that Richard had left. The things he bought were still there. I guess he didn't take them away because it was too troublesome. I went to count the lost items and found a card on the table with a note underneath saying that it was 1 million yuan and I didn't need to mortgage the house. He also asked me to use his birthday as the password. Damn, Richard actually lent me money. Although it wasn't 3 million, 1 million was enough to make me excited. But I didn't even know his birthday. I had no choice but to call him for the sake of money. He said his birthday was tomorrow, so I hurriedly wished him a happy birthday in advance and promised to pick him up at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. The next day, I arrived at Richard's house on time and spent 1,000 yuan to buy a razor as a birthday present. When we met, I gave him the gift, and we didn't mention the unpleasantness of yesterday along the way. After arriving at the company, I saw a man enter Richard's office at noon. Upon asking, I found out that he was his brother, who worked in the head office. I guess he might have asked him to go home for his birthday. In the afternoon, I went to give Richard a document to sign and found that he looked very tired, with red eyes and blue under his eyes. It was obvious that he did not sleep well last night. But when I asked him what was wrong, he just said that nothing was wrong. After work, I went home to cooperate with the police to do a second statement. After finishing, I cooked noodles but hadn't eaten yet when I received a strange text message from Richard asking me to call him. After I called, he said a few words and hung up. I guess he used me as an excuse to leave somewhere. After eating the nasty noodles, I went downstairs to throw away the garbage, and unexpectedly, I ran into Richard. He was leaning against the car and smoking. I was stunned by his handsome look. The former 3-good student actually smoked. Seeing that he was staring at the direction of my house, I guess he was still thinking about my house. I walked over to tease him, but he didn't respond. He just said that his birthday was over and he didn't eat cake, so I asked him to buy him one. I was quite surprised that Richard asked me to buy him a cake, but I agreed. There was a cake shop near the apartment, so we walked over. As soon as we entered the shop, the sweet smell hit us. The clerk asked us, and we said we would see for ourselves. There were cake models in the window, and I asked Richard to come over and choose one, but he said they were all okay. I pointed to a pink princess-style cake to tease him, and then pointed to a cake with a little man like him to ask his opinion. He didn't say anything, and when I turned around, I found that he was staring at me. After I asked him again, he agreed to choose this one. We couldn't eat the cake on the street, so we walked to my house. Under the streetlight, our shadows were sometimes long and sometimes short. I felt that Richard was very strange today, and he was in a bad mood all day. He also teased me that I usually like to observe him, which made me angry and quickened my pace. Back at the apartment, I took out the cake, put on the candles, turned off the lights, played the happy birthday song, and insisted on putting a birthday hat on Richard. He resisted, but I insisted on putting it on him and even took a picture of him wearing the hat. Although the photo was deleted in the end, I have a way to recover it. After we cut the cake, Richard didn't eat a single bite, but I thought it tasted good. Seeing him in a daze, I told him that there was beer in the refrigerator and foreign liquor and white wine in the wine cabinet. He got up and took whiskey and 2 glasses and asked me if I wanted a drink. I shook my head. He drank it all by himself, and I saw that he was unhappy, so I wanted to wait until he was drunk to get some information. After he drank a lot, I asked him what was wrong and said I was willing to be his emotional trash can. He looked at me. His eyes fell on the cream on the corner of my lips. As I was talking, he suddenly moved towards me, reached out to wipe the cream off the corner of my mouth, and the next second he put his finger in his mouth and held it. I was completely stunned. Damn, Richard must be so drunk that he is out of his mind. I quickly grabbed him 0.01 seconds before his finger went into his mouth, like an old mother worrying about her stupid son, and wiped the cream off his finger with a tissue while muttering, "Are you stupid? You put everything in your mouth, not just the cake, but the one that has been touched." You're stupid when you're drunk. I'm not drunk. He stared at me and argued. His eyes were straight. And he said he wasn't drunk? I didn't argue with him. After all, drunks don't admit they are drunk. Okay. You're not drunk. You're very sober. I'll pour you a glass of water. I stood up and took the whiskey. He had already drunk more than a third of it, and he smoked and drank more than me, a poor student. After pouring 2 glasses of water, Richard lazily leaned on the sofa, covering his eyes with his arms. I took a sip of water and thought about how to start a conversation. Today at the company, I saw a man enter your office. They said he was your older brother. Why didn't I remember you had an older brother when I was in school? He was silent for a while and then said, yeah. I asked, is he really your brother? Your biological brother? Yes. Why did your biological brother suddenly appear? Still, yeah. I asked in vain. I continued to guess. Are you the prince who was lost among the people and was found? Yes. Damn, I guessed it right. I then guessed why he was unhappy. I guess someone in his family was making things difficult for him. Is someone at home giving you trouble? He moved his arm away and looked at me, his eyes red, probably from stress and drinking. I asked again, is someone bullying you and not welcoming you anymore? He didn't answer, but took a sip of water, and I took it as his consent. I complained in my heart. I was also a poor little bullied kid. Why did he always bully me? But considering that he lent me 1 million, I still advised him, don't care too much about other people's thoughts and opinions. Just pretend you didn't see or hear them. Otherwise, you can't beat him, so you should join. You don't like to laugh, and you have a sharp tongue, so you need to be humble in the new environment. I said a lot, but he didn't say a word. I wanted to teach him how to praise others, but he didn't respond, so I gave up. I took another sip of water and continued. You probably don't know how to say nice things, so don't care about others. Just care about those who like you. Richard listened. Suddenly, he leaned forward and asked me, Benjamin, do you like me or hate me? He smelled of alcohol, and I felt like I was being tricked. This boss and creditor asking this question was just to force me to say that I liked him. I was just about to say I liked you, when suddenly an idea flashed through my mind, and I blurted out, I'm not gay, Richard. I can't answer your question, huh? I was really smart and solved the problem with a joke. He chuckled and asked, you mean I'm gay? My heart was pounding, and I quickly denied it. No. Then why did you suddenly mention this word? He even unbuttoned his cuffs. I panicked and wanted to escape, so I moved aside while joking and stood up to leave. This guy was such a jerk, and I was just trying to comfort him. Where are you going? What are you afraid of? Richard almost grabbed my wrist and pulled me hard, and I fell on the sofa. Then he put his other hand around my waist and held me tightly, and the air seemed to freeze instantly. Richard, I always thought he was just a petty and vengeful guy, but I didn't expect that he would become a completely different person when he was drunk. Yesterday, he grabbed my wrist, and the smell of alcohol swept across my neck when he spoke. It was so ambiguous that all the hairs on my body stood up. I struggled frantically, yelling at him for being drunk and acting like a hooligan, and even questioned him if he was gay. But he actually started to bring up old issues, saying that I played landlord in class, argued with him when I didn't hand him my homework, and didn't wear a school uniform during the flag-raising ceremony, all of which were caused by me provoking him. He threw me on the sofa, and I couldn't get away. I finally bit him hard. He threatened me to untie my belt, and I let him go. He asked me for a medical kit, and I lied and said I didn't have one. He also said he wanted to get a rabies vaccine. I was so angry. The next day, I asked for leave, not because I was afraid to face him, but because I had a ridiculous dream all night. In the dream, I beat him up badly, but then the situation suddenly changed and he did that to me. The situation after waking up made me even more upset. I thought about it and felt that I was in need of a girlfriend. So I remembered the female high school classmate who cared about me when my family went bankrupt. She looked pretty in the photos on her WeChat moments, so I asked her out and she agreed. I went to the appointment at 7 o'clock in the evening. I saw Richard at the table next to the one I had reserved in the restaurant. I thought about moving to the second floor, but I ran into that guy Robert again. What bad luck I have. Robert saw me. He started to make fun of me for going to work despite my poverty. I didn't tolerate him, so I said a few words to him and made him look unhappy. But this bastard was not done yet. He asked me how to please Richard and let him come forward to settle the matter of beating his head. Then I realized that Richard didn't give him the 200,000 yuan at all. I borrowed 200,000 yuan from Richard, wrote him an IOU, and even mortgaged the car, but he never gave the money to Robert. It turned out that I was played around by him. Thinking of this, I felt angry and wronged. I rushed downstairs and dragged Richard out of the restaurant. Outside the restaurant, I questioned him angrily, but he started by asking me who told me that. I got even angrier and asked him to answer directly. He admitted it, and at that moment, I really wanted to beat him up. I accused him of treating me like a fool, taking revenge on me endlessly, and asking me to go to work just to make fun of me. I asked him to return my car. After all, the money was not lent out, so he had no reason to hold it. But Richard was not in a hurry. After I finished venting, he began to explain. He said that he used the Shao family's connections to suppress the matter directly, and Robert was not worthy of the 200,000 yuan. He didn't tell me that he was busy and forgot. I was confused, and he suddenly asked me why I didn't go to the company. This topic changed my mind. Just at this moment, the female classmate came and asked me with a smile if I was waiting for her. I stood there, feeling embarrassed. This day was full of twists and turns. First, I was provoked by Robert, then I learned that I was deceived by Richard, and then I listened to his explanation. Now the female classmate came. I really didn't know how to deal with this situation. The heat had not yet completely dissipated on a summer night. The female classmate was wearing a white dress, as beautiful as a blooming lotus. She had dressed up carefully, with long curly hair draped over her shoulders and delicate makeup. Richard saw her, then looked at me and narrowed his eyes. The female classmate was surprised to recognize Richard. After all, we were sworn enemies in school. After a brief chat, I took the female classmate into the restaurant, and Richard followed. The meal with the female classmate was ordinary, and I thought that the relationship could be cultivated slowly. When I returned to the apartment and was about to go home, a man in a floral shirt called me. It turned out to be the man who had dinner with Richard in the restaurant, and he actually knew my name. He took out a card and said there was 200,000 yuan in it. He asked me to keep an eye on Richard and report his whereabouts and daily life to him. He also said that he would give me more money if I did a good job. I refused immediately because I couldn't do anything that would pry in my privacy. But he kept raising the price from 300,000 to 1 million and threatened that if I didn't agree, he would not give up. I thought this was a business opportunity, so I decisively raised the price to 1.2 million and made the deal. After he left, I realized that my phone was recording our conversation. After I got home, I planned to tell Richard about it so that I could earn another $1.2 million from him, and I also felt that Richard was more reliable. But before the call was connected, I suddenly thought about whether my phone was being monitored, so I quickly hung up. Richard called back, and I turned off my phone. I didn't expect him to come. There was a quick knock on the door. I walked to the door, carefully with a pot in my left hand, a kitchen knife in my right hand, and a baseball bat stuck in my back. When I heard it was him, I dragged him into the house, closed the door, and asked him if he was being followed. He looked at me with a puzzled look on his face and asked me what I was doing. I nervously asked Richard if he was being followed, and he said no with certainty. Seeing his puzzled expression, I quickly explained that someone had asked me to keep an eye on him today, and I shook the pot and kitchen knife in my hands, saying that I had recorded the conversation. He asked me to put these things aside first, and then I reacted and proposed the conditions for getting the car back. Unexpectedly, he agreed so readily. I quickly took out my cell phone and played the recording. I heard the sound of me raising the price. I felt a little embarrassed and hurriedly explained that I wanted the other party to back off. When I learned that it was his cousin who was looking for me, I was shocked and asked him why his cousin was staring at him. He said he was helping his older brother. I was trying to guess the reason, but he suddenly asked me to peel an orange. I was halfway through peeling when I realized what was going on and threw the half-peeled orange to him. Hearing him say that his elder brother hated him, I seemed to understand why he was in a low mood on his birthday yesterday. In order to ease the atmosphere, I quickly changed the subject and promised to let him review the report first. His suspicious look and raised eyebrows made me feel uneasy. I always felt that he was weird and even doubted whether he was really gay. Richard left. I happily changed the alarm clock to scold him. The next day, when I went to the company, I received a threatening message from Frank, and I replied angrily. Richard gave me the car keys, and to show my sincerity, I showed him the summary of my work every day before work. The summary was a chronicle, such as when Richard ate and what he ate. Frank finally couldn't help but call me and scolded me, asking me to send the important ones, but I didn't send anything for a week. That day, when I was getting off work, I was blocked by Frank. He was so angry that he wanted to beat me up. Just then, Richard arrived in a Maybach. Frank raised his fist to hit me, but put it down when Richard came. I was staring at his crotch, thinking that his family was not bankrupt. So how could he be beaten easily? Anyway, Richard would help me. Richard came over and asked us when we met. We both opened our mouths and shut our mouths at the same time, secretly calling each other stupid. Frank hurriedly explained that we had just met and there was a little argument. Richard came here on the pretext of looking at a house and invited Frank to join him, and the three of them got in the car and drove to my house again. I made tea for them and introduced the house layout. Richard looked around and said it would be fine if it was no larger than 200 square meters. At this time, Frank mocked me for spending money on cleaning services, and I scolded him for meddling in my business. As I was speaking, there was a knock on the door. I opened the door and saw a man who looked like a nobleman. He said that Mr. Shao had asked him to come. I let him in, but I saw Frank with a grim face, as if he was nailed to the sofa. The man asked Frank to follow him, but Frank was so scared that he shook his head desperately and asked Richard for help. But Richard coldly shook him off, and the man said that it was thanks to Richard that he found this place. Frank was shocked and scared. Richard said slowly that he underestimated Frank and knew many of his secrets. It turned out that in the Shao family, where interests are paramount and family affection is weak, Richard checked everyone to protect himself. Frank was so angry that he rushed forward to fight with Richard, but was grabbed by the man. Frank struggled and shouted, saying that the man was a pervert, that he had borrowed money for gambling and couldn't pay it back, and that he had slept with him and was forced to do all kinds of shameful things. In the end, the man took the struggling Frank away and slammed the door. Frank was taken away. I sat on the sofa, full of confusion, and asked Richard what happened. He said that the man was Frank's creditor, and because Frank couldn't pay the money, the man slept with him. I was so shocked that my jaw dropped. Richard smiled and asked me if I couldn't accept it. Of course I couldn't accept it. I asked Frank why he borrowed money. Richard said he lost a lot of money gambling and was beaten. I was thinking that even if I couldn't pay the money back, I couldn't pay it back with my body. As I was saying this, I suddenly realized that Richard was my creditor and he wouldn't have such dirty thoughts. I quickly ordered him to leave. Richard said he was joking, and then he got up and left. After work on Friday, I was happily preparing to enjoy the weekend and had made an appointment with a female classmate to go to the amusement park, but my assistant said Richard was looking for me. After entering the office, he didn't even look up and told me to go back and pack my things because I was going to attend an event with him and would not be back until the weekend, so I should bring some spare clothes. I was not happy when I heard that and explained that I had an appointment. He asked me what appointment it was, and I said it was with Kelly, thinking that he would understand, but he actually said that work was more important than the appointment and asked me to pack my things. I was upset and didn't say anything. He then asked me if I liked Kelly and said that I should focus on my work now, because making money is the most important thing. I deliberately sang the opposite tune, saying that there was a sign of development between me and Kelly. He was silent for a while, and then asked me to pay back the money, saying that Frank asked me to pay back the $1.2 million or he would call the police. I had no choice but to agree to go with him. Suddenly, I remembered that Kelly and Richard had a good relationship when they were in school. I wondered if he liked Kelly, so he deliberately targeted me. But I wasn't too angry. After all, the relationship with Kelly hadn't developed yet. Richard called me again and didn't mention paying back the money, but just said that Kelly and I were not suitable, and that we shouldn't be in a relationship at this stage, and that making money should be the first priority. I understood his thoughts, and I was actually a little happy, as if I had discovered his little secret. I went home to pack my things, and Richard came to pick me up. After driving for a while, the car stopped at the harbor. Not far away was a super luxurious cruise ship, brightly lit and magnificent. I immediately asked Richard 3 questions in a row and confirmed that I was going to board this cruise ship. I also found out that it was the ocean that I had taken before. I was so excited that I pulled Richard on board. After showing my ID on board, I was shocked by the luxurious interior decoration as soon as I entered. Although it was not my first time here, I still felt like walking into a royal palace. Following Richard to the 6th floor, he opened the door to the presidential suite, and my jaw dropped. My father and I had stayed in a balcony room before, and the luxury of this presidential suite was beyond imagination. The living room is incredibly large, and there's also a sauna, an open-air balcony, a conference room, fruit snacks, red wine and champagne, and the butler service is top-notch. I ran around the rooms like a happy duck, shouting with excitement. But when Richard told me that my room was on the 2nd floor, an inner cabin, I was stunned. I went in and saw that the room was only 20 square meters, like an ordinary hotel standard room, without even a window. After seeing the luxury of the presidential suite, I felt a huge gap when I looked at the interior cabin. I tossed and turned in bed in discomfort and was madly jealous of Richard. Richard came to the cruise ship to attend a 2-day and 2-night banquet. Those who came were either rich or noble. Most of them knew that the Luo family was bankrupt, but they didn't know me. The dinner started at 8 p.m. Richard came to call me half an hour ago. I was lying on the bed in a decadent manner and said I didn't want to go. I felt uncomfortable. Richard explained that the company only booked one presidential suite and the room was full. I ignored him. He also told me to sleep on the sofa in his room. After all, the environment in the cabin was bad and noisy. After thinking about it, I thought Richard liked Kelly, so I should be safe, so I agreed. I changed into formal clothes, fixed my hair, and followed Richard to the luxurious hall, where crystal chandeliers shone brightly and men and women were dressed in luxurious attire. A woman with big wavy hair came to Richard, and Richard took my hand and put his arm around my waist, saying that I was taking too long to change clothes. I knew he was using me as a shield, but I still felt a little uncomfortable when he was hugged. As soon as the curly-haired woman left, I asked Richard if the woman liked him, and he admitted that he liked him. I guessed that he was using me as a shield to avoid the woman's entanglement, and it seems that my guess was correct. After that, we continued to walk inside. Richard greeted many acquaintances, and I stood by. I felt hungry after seeing the delicious food, and I kept licking my lips while staring at the roasted beef bones. Richard saw this and dragged me to the food area under the pretext of being an acquaintance. I thought he was hungry and ran to get a plate, but he only had a glass of red wine and no food. My plate was piled up like a mountain, but he still said I looked like a pig. He happened to see an acquaintance and told me to come find him after I finished eating, and then he left. I was eating happily when I heard someone calling me. I turned around and saw that it was Frank, and the creditor was with him. I don't know why, but they looked so good together to me, and I couldn't help but start to imagine them like crazy. Frank let the creditor go first and started chatting with me. I asked him if he wanted to eat and handed him the plate, but he stared at the cherry tomatoes and thought of bad memories, so he didn't eat. He asked me if I came with Richard and said that Richard was very nice to me. I thought Richard was fickle and complained to him that Richard asked me for the 1.2 million in his name. Frank said he didn't ask Richard to ask, and I laughed and told him not to trust his intuition. After I finished eating, I went to put the plate away. Frank chased me for 1.2 million. I used the excuse that I had given it to Richard and would not return it to him. He pulled me to go and get it back. During the tug, I swung my arm and the plate rubbed against the man next to me, getting greasy. Frank and I were stunned. When the man looked up, I saw that it was Robert. I was wondering why Robert was here, and he angrily said that I had deliberately soiled his clothes and dragged me away, wanting to find a place where no one was around to settle the score. I tried to shake my hand off, but it didn't work. Then Frank came over to stop Robert and told him to let me go. Robert not only refused to listen, but also arrogantly told Frank to mind his own business. Frank picked up the roasted lamb leg and threw it at Robert without saying anything, full of provocation. Robert was so angry that he punched him. I was afraid that Frank would suffer a loss, so I kicked Robert and he fell to the ground, attracting the attention of others. Robert was so angry that he hugged Frank and started a fight. I hurried to help. After a fight, Frank pinned Robert down and punched him in the face. The security personnel came and pulled us apart quickly, and the cruise management also came to inquire about the situation. Robert played a trick to blackmail us, saying that we were causing trouble. At this time, Richard came. The manager greeted him respectfully, but Richard only asked me what was going on. His partial tone made Frank raise his lips. Of course, I didn't tell the truth. I just said that Robert suddenly pulled me and cursed. Richard proposed to talk to Robert privately, and Robert dared not refuse. Frank pulled me aside, saying that men should solve their own problems and that Richard liked me. I didn't believe him at all, so he suggested to test it out, and without saying anything, he pulled me into the box, called a few long-legged women over, and told me to choose whatever I wanted. I don't like this, but he provoked me. I teased him and asked if he was little, which made him very angry. I started to uncontrollably imagine the scene of him and that man in my mind again. Frank insisted that I choose one from those girls. I refused, so he forced me with 1.2 million and cover my mouth and picked 4 girls to stay. The girls sat down next to each other, and one of them put her hand on my shoulder. I got scared and stood up quickly and walked around the box with the excuse that my feet were numb. Frank was drinking with the girls and reading palms, and I stared at him, wondering who was O and who was one between him and the man. I couldn't help but take out my phone to check it out, but when I clicked it, a hot dynamic picture popped up, and I was so scared that I quickly turned it off. Frank saw me playing with my phone and yelled at me. I almost saw the picture and was annoyed. I wanted to leave when he yelled at me. He didn't expect me to be serious, so he quickly pulled me and said that I should chat with him because he helped fight. I felt sorry for him and stayed. As soon as I sat down, I asked him if he had any troubles. I also teased him about his relationship with that man, guessing that he was a little oh. I imagined the contrast of how a 1.9-meter tall man would feel when he was treated like that. He was so angry that he didn't want to pay attention to me. He suddenly poured 2 glasses of whiskey, trying to get me drunk, and said he had never seen anyone get drunk in one gulp, so he wanted to try me. I tried my best to refuse, saying that I really get drunk in one gulp, but he didn't listen at all and directly rushed over to me, pinched my face, and poured the wine into my mouth. I spit out bubbles like a fish, and most of the glass of wine spilled out. When he relaxed, I kicked him away in anger, picked up half a bottle of whiskey, and poured it into his mouth. He was choked and coughed, cursing me while coughing. Neither of us gave in. We kept swearing at each other and finally started fighting. We rolled off the sofa onto the floor, kicking and pulling each other's hair, fighting like 2 little kids. The girls next to us were stunned. The whole box was filled with the sounds of our shouting and fighting. It was a mess. Several girls watched me and Frank fighting again, trying to pull us apart, but failing. Just as I was getting anxious, I banged my head on the base of the coffee table, and I let go of Frank in pain. He took the opportunity to get up and ride on me to beat me, but found that I was already drunk and my eyes were staring. He stood up with disdain, sat on the sofa, and called Richard to say that I was drunk, trying to fan the flames, but was interrupted by Richard's words, "I'll be there right away." The girls helped me to the sofa, and Frank asked them to take good care of me, some to give me water, some to massage my legs. I felt so uncomfortable that I tried to drive them away, but it was of no use. I saw Frank and thought about how he had forced me to drink, so I wanted to strangle him. I finally got to him, and just as I was grabbing him, the door to the box opened and Richard walked in. Frank tried to push me away, but I stumbled backwards and Richard quickly held me up, and I fell into his arms. I was talking to Richard in a daze and wanted to show him something interesting. I turned around and looked for Frank, asking him if he was little O and discussing whether that kind of thing was fun. Frank wanted to run away, but Richard lied to me and said he would catch him back. I stood straight and said I could stand firm. Richard went to catch Frank, and Frank ran out the door, but he bumped into the waiter and fell. Richard grabbed his legs and dragged him back to the box. Frank was terrified and called for help. He put his phone in his pocket, but Richard took it and threw it on the coffee table. He could only sit on the floor and wait to see whether the people he called were better or Richard was better. He threatened in his heart that if his man came, Richard and I would be finished. At this moment, he was lying on the sofa drunkenly. His eyes were empty, his mind was in a mess, and he had long forgotten what he wanted to ask. The sounds around him were vague, and he could only hear people talking about some incomprehensible things. Frank sat on the ground and yelled at Richard, "Hey, Richard, do you like Benjamin, this kid? Otherwise, why would you listen to him?" I was wondering when I heard this, like me? How is that possible? Richard sneered and retorted, "Because you're gay, you think you know a lot about this?" Frank must be very angry. If he could beat him, he would definitely fight. I really didn't understand what was going on, but Frank kept asking me questions, saying that I had a good feeling about Richard and that we could try to develop the relationship. This was all bullshit, and I was as straight as a whim could be. Later, Richard wanted to take me back. I groggily said I could walk, but he picked me up anyway. There was a strange tenderness in his movements, and he protected my face with his hands to prevent others from seeing my drunken state. When I regained consciousness, I was already on the sofa in the presidential suite. Richard went into the bathroom to run the water, then came out to help me undress and prepare for a shower. His fingertips were cool, and when they touched my skin, I shivered for no apparent reason. The experience of this evening was so strange. From the drinking party at the beginning to being taken care of by Richard now, my life seemed to have suddenly taken a turn. I don't know what will happen next. I was so drunk last night that I only remember Richard carrying me back to the presidential suite. When I woke up the next day, the sun was so bright that it hurt my eyes. When I opened my eyes, I saw Richard sleeping next to me. I was so scared that I quickly closed my eyes and pretended to sleep, wondering what was going on. As I was thinking, I subconsciously touched it and froze. I was actually naked. This shocked me, and all kinds of terrible images flashed through my mind. I secretly glanced at Richard, and fortunately he was wearing clothes. But this look made me discover a new world. The size made me wonder if he had undergone any surgery. I was feeling suffocated in the quilt, and as soon as I poked my head out, Richard caught me. He teased my hair with a smile, and his gentle tone and smiling eyes made me stunned. It turned out that he looked so good when he smiled. I hurriedly asked where my clothes were and who took them off for me, but he answered nonchalantly. Then I remembered that he must have helped me take a bath last night. How embarrassing for two grown men. Then he said I had thrown my clothes in the trash because the collar was torn and asked me what the bite marks on my ears and the back of my neck were. I said it was Frank, but I really can't remember what happened. Now I have nothing to wear. I asked him to help me find something, but he kept dragging his feet. I got angry and went straight back to bed. I won't leave the bed today because I have nothing to wear. Who would have thought that I just went to a drinking party and my life would be in chaos after I woke up? I don't know what this inexplicable development between Richard and me will lead to. The embarrassing scene when I woke up yesterday is still vivid in my mind. Fortunately, Richard had no choice but to throw me clothes and told me to get up and have breakfast. His clothes were too big, so I was quite comfortable wearing them. But when I saw the underwear, I couldn't help but compare them in my mind. After getting dressed, I went to the restaurant and Richard was already sitting there. The sun shone in and the sea breeze brought the smell of the sea, making the whole room bright and cozy. He was reading a financial weekly with a cool and noble temperament. When he saw me wearing his clothes, he slightly raised the corner of his lip. While eating, I casually asked him about how drinking coffee early in the morning was bad for his stomach, but he teased me whether I was concerned about him. I curled my lips and ignored him. Later, he asked me about the incident of me crawling under the quilt. I quickly thought that I was looking for clothes, but he ruthlessly exposed me and asked me if I had some kind of fetish to look at him there. This really choked me. I couldn't believe that the good student of the past was now talking dirty. We stayed on the cruise ship for another day and night. Richard didn't let me sleep on the sofa. After that drunken night, I felt more at ease with him. I felt that although his words became more vulgar, he seemed to be a much better person than when we were in school. On the way back, he said that this time I was traveling with him and the company would give me a subsidy, which made me very happy. When we got to the downstairs of my apartment, he said he wanted to go to the bathroom, so I went upstairs with him. But I never expected that as soon as I arrived at the door, I would see Frank waiting there with a ferocious look on his face. He grabbed me by the collar and asked me to pay back the $1.2 million. Then I remembered the fight between him and I on the cruise ship. In the past, I would have paid him back without saying a word, but now I have no money. Property fees, living expenses, money is spent like water. And he came to collect the debt so fiercely. I can't just compromise and encourage his unhealthy behavior. I thought that after this trip with Richard, life would return to normal, but I didn't expect Frank's disturbance to stir up another storm. As soon as I got home, Frank grabbed me by the collar and asked me to pay him back. We started fighting like two little lions, cursing and sparring. Richard tried to stop us, but we couldn't stop and only wanted to beat each other up. Richard had no choice but to hug me, but Frank's fist came at me. I was desperate, and Richard kicked him away. I couldn't help but laugh and gloating. Frank was angry and resentful, but was frightened by Richard's warning eyes. Richard asked him to go back first and pretended to be a good person and said he wanted to talk to me. Frank threatened to come again before leaving. Unexpectedly, as soon as Frank left, Richard received a text message. He actually transferred $2 million to Frank to thank him for coming to make trouble. I was full of doubts. What was going on? After entering the house, Richard urged me to return the money to Frank. I was so angry that I didn't agree easily. Although I felt a little relieved, Frank's attitude really made me unhappy. As we were talking, Richard said that my ear was inflamed and that Frank had bit me the day before yesterday. He wouldn't get the medical kit, came back to disinfect my ear, and mentioned that there was also a wound on my neck. Then Richard mentioned the matter of paying back the money, and I directly retorted, firmly saying that I would not pay it back, and threatened to let Frank sue me. At this time, Richard suddenly said that if I didn't want to pay it back, I could move to his place for a while. I looked confused, and he explained that the Shao family didn't like him, and in comparison, he was more willing to help me. When he said this, his tone was low and hoarse, as if he was hiding a lot of bad memories. Richard asked me to move in with him and explained that he was more than willing to help me. Although he had a bitter smile on his face, I chose to believe him and followed him to his luxurious villa that night. Once there, I chose the largest room next to Richard's. At dinner time, I wanted to order takeout to save trouble, but Richard went into the kitchen and said the food outside was not good and he wanted to cook it himself. I was embarrassed to just sit there and wait, so I took the initiative to help wash the vegetables. He took out a large prawn from the refrigerator and handled the shrimp thread with great skill. I was itching to try it. As soon as I started, the shrimp head and shrimp thread separated. I tried one after another. Except for the two that he successfully handled, all the other 24 shrimps were crushed by me and became test subjects. I was so embarrassed, but he gently said that it could be cleaned again. At that moment, my heart beat faster for no reason, and I even had the thought of turning into a girl. In the end, Richard cooked 3 dishes and a soup. The food was so delicious that I finished 2 large bowls of rice and ate all the dishes. During the meal, we talked about taking the bus to work. In order to avoid suspicion, we planned to stagger the time. He even joked that it was like having an affair, and I laughed when I heard it. At this time, the phone rang. It was Kelly, our high school classmate who I had dated before. Richard glanced at my phone. I saw his look and felt a little guilty. I took the phone to the balcony to answer the call. Kelly asked me if I was home. I said I was eating. She understood immediately and ended the call. Actually, it's not that Kelly is a bad person. It's just that I don't have any feelings for her. Besides, the last time Richard asked me to go to his office, I felt that he seemed to like Kelly, and I, a small employee, can't compete with the boss for her. Besides, in my current situation, with my family bankrupt and no ambition, I'd better not waste the time of such a good girl. I should be cool to her and not keep her hanging. After hanging up the phone with Kelly and returning to the dining table, Richard seemed surprised that I ended the call so quickly. He mentioned that he saw Kelly calling and explained that it was not intentional. I teased him that he was indeed a top student who could read the name clearly even if it was backwards. As we chatted, the topic turned to finding a wife. I said I would find someone with a high IQ in the future so that my children would not inherit my characteristics. But he suddenly said that he did not plan to find a wife. I was full of doubts, but he changed the subject and told me to eat quickly and wash the dishes after dinner. After dinner, I washed the dishes in the dishwasher. Because I was full, I wanted to go out for a walk, but since I was not familiar with the environment, I went to the gym to walk slowly on the treadmill. After I returned to the room and was lying down, Richard came to tell me the location of daily necessities. He also asked me about the thing I said I wanted to show him when I was drunk on the cruise ship, but I couldn't remember it at all. After he left, I accidentally saw the browsing history between men on my mobile browser, and then I remembered that it seemed to be related to what I wanted to show Richard. I clicked on it out of curiosity and saw some blushing scenes. I felt uncomfortable all over and tossed and turned in bed. Finally, I covered myself with the quilt, clamped the pillow between my legs, and immersed myself in it. I was watching intently when Richard suddenly knocked on the door. I didn't respond, but he just opened the door and came in. Before I could react, the quilt was pulled back and his eyes fell on the phone screen. I denied it 3 times in an instant, but I was panicking and so embarrassed that I could have dug a hole in the wall with my toes. I really didn't know how to face him. This situation was terrible. Chapter 46, Shameless.